just give it a go. Just literally try it. There's nothing wrong with failing. You learn from that, sort of fail more, I think.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about digital leadership and change. I'm Paul Thomas.
And I'm Zoe Amma. On today's episode, we're sharing our conversation with Sharon Jones, Head of Digital Innovation at the King's Fund. Sharon has worked as an editor and producer in organisations such as MTV, Sky, and among others, BBC.
The BBC, Zoe? It's been a quite quiet weekend for them, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has been quite quiet. I suppose it depends who you speak to. But obviously, they have been all over the press. Most of our listeners will have seen the Gary Lineker story. And in fact, we're recording on Monday the 13th. And it was announced earlier today that he's returning to the BBC after being suspended from Match of the Day. Most people will know that was due to him tweeting, criticising the language used by ministers when discussing the government's asylum policy. So you and I are both big advocates for use of social media by leaders in and around organisations. So Paul, what did you think of this story?
I just can't believe we're still talking about this, all these years later. I was just sort of going through a few books earlier on and looking at the Clue Train Manifesto came out in 2000. So that's 23 years ago. A book we know and love, Ewan Semple's Organisations Don't Tweet, People Do, came out in 2012. So we're quite far down the line, and yet we're still having this conversation about guidelines and what people can and can't say within and without organizations and things. So it was a little bit depressing to find ourselves back here, but a massive story, and a real sort of sense of the BBC struggling, obviously, with its decision making and the way it manages its own policies against one of their biggest stars in Gary Lineker, who, it's not unusual behavior for him to talk out on subjects that he's passionate about. He does it all the time. And I think I'm right in saying that he's had some sort of shots fired across the bow in past times where he said something that has been close to the bone. But this time, because of government pressure, allegedly, it seems that he's been forced out of his role. Hosting Match of the Day, which obviously other listeners to this podcast will realise is a thing that's quite close and dear to my heart as a football fan, who was faced with about 35 minutes in total of football highlights with no commentators, no commentators, no pundits, no presenters, which was completely counter to the experience, because guess what? Match of the Day is delivered by a team, and the team lost its captain and they weren't happy about it.
Exactly. It makes you think how this kind of content is so much driven by personalities, as indeed a lot of other content is. But I think this story is also a bit of a reminder to organisations that they need to think about what is workable and proportionate and realistic to put in their social media guidelines. Because if you take the wrong tone, or you try to be a bit too all-encompassing, or the guidelines are very widely drafted, and then people push back against it quite reasonably, then your guidelines won't have credibility.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, and I think what we've heard today is that Gary Lineker is reinstated whilst they review the guidelines. Be interested to know who's going to go in and do that review of their social media guidelines. Until then, he's going to apparently toe the line. But he was straight onto Twitter again to sort of reiterate his position, saying that although it's been a hard couple of days, it's nothing compared to the hardships faced by people seeking asylum on these shores. So he's maybe not going to be critical of the policy itself, but he's certainly going to carry on with giving his opinion. And I think it is tough with organisations. I was just thinking about the first social media policy I wrote, and I was asked to sort of include a clause around political opinions and political views. And I think that was probably okay when we first wrote the guidelines, probably back in 2010, 2012. It was probably just about okay. But we had to review those on a regular basis. And I don't think it's good enough to review them every couple of years with the speed that social media moves at. And we had to sort of address that because we were finding that people that were in positions of leadership within the organisation I worked for were still talking about political opinions, and it's really hard to stop them from doing that. So yeah, I think it would be an interesting few weeks for the BBC as they sort of navigate this, and hopefully they can come out with something that's a bit more tailored to the type of people that they have working for them as an organisation.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a big question, isn't there? In fact, two big questions. There's one about where does social justice end and politics begin? Because one of the things I think we both saw in the BBC social media guidelines is that they're trying to guide people towards not getting involved in campaigns. In fact, I think there's even a line in those guidelines saying don't get involved in virtue signalling. I mean, what does that even mean? Does that mean you can't talk about Lives Matter, which is obviously a hugely important thing? And then also, I think that speaks to how the nature of power has shifted between organisation and employee, which has been a big theme of what we've talked about on this podcast. And if you put things into your social media guidelines that are not reasonable to ask for, because after all, as we both know, Gary Lineker is a football pundit rather than a news journalist, then it's more likely that people will ignore them, flout them, push against them, however you want to look at it. And that means that those guidelines don't have value for certain people. So I think it's really important to bear that in mind. What's going to work? What's going to be proportionate?
Yeah, and I think the other thing this podcast is, we say it's about digital leadership and change, and we sort of amused at the beginning of this season. Actually, we talked about how that might have shifted for us. It's more about leadership than anything else, and you start to look at, well, who's shown real leadership in this whole story? And as I said, Gary Lineker, it was his team, it was the people he works with that immediately jumped in behind him and supported him through this. So as a sort of a strong leadership figure, there were also calls across social media for him to run for absolutely everything from prime minister to God knows what else. I mean, it's Gary Lineker and a strong display of leadership from him that the BBC could do very well to learn from.
Exactly. I think that's the whole point, isn't it? That he's really acted in line with his values. And any organisation who is now frantically scrambling to review their social media guidelines, I think what you have to scenario plan for is that if you do have to put some quite strict stuff in there about people can and can't say, you have to be prepared for a situation where an individual or perhaps a group of people will push back and they'll say, no, we're not doing that because it's important we speak out on that. And had the BBC not clamped down, this could have led to some kind of strike action, couldn't it? And could we see the equivalent of that happening in an organisation? People do resign from things in principle, or refuse to do things in principle, and that is equally applicable to social media as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it totally. The other thing that it brought to light was I was most amused by the term being coined emergency podcast, because I think you shared the link to the podcast that the team, it was Alistair Campbell, wasn't it, put an emergency podcast together. The Rest is Politics podcast emergency episode, Gary Lineker, BBC in Crisis and Small Boats, which is funny again because as we both discussed, The Rest is Politics is actually published through Goalhanger, his production company, which again, just undermines how very silly this all got over the weekend.
Well, is this an emergency podcast, Paul? We need a nice audio clip of an ambulance rushing by.
Well, it did make me laugh about the word emergency in front of words that just aren't emergencies at all. So I think the whole thing just made me want to go for an emergency lie down, because it was all a bit much. But no, I'm pleased that as a football fan, I am pleased that I won't have to sit through commentary-less football highlights again next weekend. I think all eyes and ears will be very much on that opening line from Gary Lineker when he rocks up on Match of the Day on Saturday night. He's usually very, very, very good at those first one-liners when he introduces his program. So I'm looking forward to what he's going to say next week. I'm sure it won't be ignored.
But whatever he says, he'll be delivering it with a twinkle in his eye and a beautifully ironed shirt.
Yes. For listeners, we did have an exchange of messages over the weekend where I said, well, I don't really watch the Match of the Day for the presenters, but I watch it for the football. And Zoe replied, I watch it for the fashion, which with some of Micah Richards' outfits that he wears on Match of the Day and on the TV, I'm in full agreement with. There is a fashion show on Match of the Day and on football TV every weekend. Anyway, now for our interview with Sharon Jones of the King's Fund.
We are very excited to welcome Sharon Jones to the podcast today. Sharon's varied and impactful career has encompassed the public, private and not-for-profit sectors. With TV production in her sights, her career began at MTV, where she developed an eye for storytelling, leading to a stint in children's TV, working for a production who were commissioned by the BBC. Following this, she spent the next few years using her keen journalistic skills as senior editor and producer for a range of websites, including AOL. From there, her digital knowledge led to working in digital production for BBC Radio 1 and Sky TV Guide, where she interviewed the great and the good, but also worked across the Sky Arts and Sky Atlantic websites. Realising the vast set of skills she'd gathered in the commercial sector could greatly benefit the non-profit sector, she followed her heart and became head of digital for the UK's largest children's reading charity, BookTrust. There, she transformed their digital presence, relaunching their website, content and social media strategies, developing and executing their biggest campaigns, all while training and upskilling staff. She currently works for the health and care think tank The King's Fund as their head of digital innovation, where she is leading on the fund's digital vision by moving the organisation forward with audiences and with digital at its heart. Sharon, welcome to Starts at the Top.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
We are so happy to have you here today. And we are especially interested to hear about your journey because going through your bio, you've done so many interesting things working with everyone from AOL to BBC to Sky. Can you take us through that journey and how it develops?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's definitely varied, and obviously I've crossed over a lot of different sectors. But I think what for me has been the real kind of core of them all have been audiences. And they've all been really focused on their audience and really passionate about serving the people that they're trying to reach and trying to find new audiences. And I think mixed into that with like journalism and storytelling, I've just found a kind of thread that's gone through all of those different roles, even though they sound really, really different. I've always been drawn to like this creative element, but equally, it's got a purpose in terms of trying to serve an audience. So that to me has been like the biggest kind of thread, although it seems very kind of here, there and everywhere. That's kind of been the biggest thing.
That's really interesting. And do you feel that journalism experience has been quite helpful for where you are now in terms of digital?
Definitely. I think even in the role that I'm in now, when you want to piece together, a strategy or something really tangible like an animation or a podcast, they all still need a story to tell, internally and externally to an audience. And I think having that kind of writing background has really stood me in good stead for all the jobs that I've done. Obviously, there's an element of writing in all of them, whether you're writing a kind of paper or you're writing a script or you're, writing some kind of blurb. There's always an element of that, which I always enjoy. But it's just kind of using digital now and using the storytelling techniques around digital that have really enhanced all of those roles and have been all the way through pretty much every single job I've done, apart from the early days where I wasn't fully working in digital and I was working in TV. However, working in TV, it's still all about storytelling. It's still about taking the audience, the person who's watching on a journey. It's just in a different way from digital.
And out of those many and varied experiences, are there some of them which have really informed the way that you lead now?
Yeah, I think one of them that really stands out was working at Radio 1. And the reason that is because it's a real period of my life. I was quite young. I didn't have children. So, you could really throw yourself into it. But the reason that one stands out is the leadership. I've never kind of seen people who led in the way that they did there. And one person in particular, she was really inspiring. She was a woman, she was a Black woman, she was really senior exec. But she was kind of humble. She knew her stuff. So, she had authority. And this mixture of that in one person was really, really inspiring. She made good decisions, but she was also just human. She just, she made mistakes. She wasn't kind of, so up on this pedestal that you couldn't reach her. She was really approachable and she was really accessible. And when you're in sort of a junior member of staff and you want to speak to somebody like that, they could be really scary when they're like at the top of the tree, so to speak. But she wasn't. And I found like her leadership and some of the other members at the top there really inspiring and actually just sort of really down to earth in a way that I wouldn't have expected when I'd sort of joined such a kind of well-known, organisation.
It's really exciting. It sounds like that woman, the experience of working with her really stayed with you.
Definitely. And I think it's something like in the back of my mind, I always sort of refer back to her in some way, maybe not kind of explicitly, but thinking, oh yeah, what was it about her that made her such a good leader? She's not the only person I've encountered in my career who have really inspired me. There's other people as well. She stands out, but there's other people, like when I worked at BookTrust, I had a really supportive boss. And she also kind of stood out in a completely different way, in a way about having good ideas and executing those ideas and not being kind of your kind of stiff charity boss. She just has a sparkle about her. I think that's more like personality rather than necessarily leadership. But it's good to see somebody in that role who could just be themselves. And that's something that stood out for me as well.
It's funny, isn't it, when you think back over different managers and leaders that you've experienced over your career, and whether you got on with them or not, there's usually something that you can take away. There's infinite times that I start to quote old line managers, regardless kind of how I felt about them. And one in particular, I won't name names, but day to day could be a real pain in the backside. But some of the things that they shared with us, or some of the ideas, I still use today. And I can't tell you any of them because people might be listening and say, oh, I know who that was. But it's just those little snippets, those little tidbits of stuff that you take forwards with you. And that certainly in my lifetime, in my work lifetime, there have been things that stood out. One boss in particular who has just changed careers to become a stand-up comedian, which is
amazing.
Pretty unbelievable stuff. Completely amazing. I need to go and have coffee with her, find out where that's headed.
Wow, that's quite a career change. Quite inspiring in another way, isn't it? It's just like giving it a go, having the courage to try something completely new. I think that's always something to admire as a quality in leaders, and not to be kind of scared to make mistakes, to have a vulnerability, to just show that human side. And I find I'm drawn to leaders who are like that, rather than the sort of command and control type leaders, which, it seems quite obvious really, but yeah, you remember your good ones and you remember the ones that aren't so good. And even from those people I've had in the past, you always learn like that's how not to do leadership, or that's not how I want to do it.
Incredibly formative relationship, isn't it? Because you spend so much time with your boss, even in this age of remote working, hybrid working, and they're going to influence you in some way, whether for better or for worse. And their actions are going to stay with you, aren't they? Because they impact you so directly.
Absolutely. And their, their actions and their behaviours and what they say and how they present themselves, not necessarily, the clothes they wear, but just the kind of that outward facing facet of themselves is really key. And I think that has really helped me. It doesn't mean I don't have my own style. It just means it's kind of made me think, what's been good about that person that I think would lend itself well in the roles that I've had, and it's taken me into spaces that I think, it's worked.
Exciting. So I guess big thing that's come out of your career so far feels like it's about adaptability, as well as having those values and those kind of golden threads of various interests that run through everything. And how has that led you to where you are now?
I think I've always kind of got to the point where I think if I've done something to the point that I'm not learning, or I feel like I need to try and change, I'll take that leap. And that's probably why my career looks quite, I've done lots of different things. And it's about courage. And I'm always trying to push myself more to do things that take me out of my comfort zone, or something I haven't tried before. And some of these roles have lent themselves to that. So I think that in terms of where I am now, I don't have a health and care background, but I have a really strong digital background. And I'm keen on giving people what they want in terms of digital experiences. And that's why it can cross many sectors, because it's not about necessarily having that specialist health and care knowledge, or knowledge about children's literature, or knowledge about, entertainment. It's about giving people what they want, the way they want it, in a timely fashion, and in the spaces that they inhabit, rather than forcing it on them and hoping that they'll take it up.
I think this podcast is nothing but about how digital crosses over sectors and disciplines and all sorts of different things. And I think that's really true, isn't it? We can find ourselves quite pigeonholed in spaces. For example, it's no coincidence that two of my clients are accountancy firms, where I worked for 10 years within an accountancy firm. And I try to sort of go off and work with other organisations, working with a health charity at the moment, and other places where you can apply the same level of thinking, but to a completely different discipline. So that variety has always been important to me.
Definitely.
All is the fun side of accounting, just to reassure you, Sharon.
Yeah, there was this line, wasn't there? I can't remember. I need to find out where this came from, but there was I think it was an article, and I think it was a Forbes article. We'll have to go away and check it. But I think it was headlined "Why Accountants Will Change the World," or "Why Accountants Will Save the World." I think it actually was. I still haven't got to the bottom of exactly why, but they are, quite important. My accountant in particular is fairly important, and I live by what they say.
They're definitely underestimated. I think, they're creative in a different way. They probably get a bit pigeonholed, but we definitely
not
need
too
them.
Creative.
Oh no, not that kind of creative. But that's what underpins the vision of what we want to try and do. We need to have the funds to do that. So you need an accountant who kind of understands what you're trying to achieve, and also finds the money for it.
Exactly.
So bringing it back to the present day and the King's Fund, we'd love to hear a bit about some of the digital challenges and opportunities you're currently facing.
Yeah, absolutely. So my role there is as head of digital innovation. And I think the challenges are how we're going to make the most impact in the health and care sector, which is just a huge challenge because of, the current state of the NHS. It's very challenging, the external environment, but also it's about having the digital capability and making sure staff feel confident in what they're doing, and also producing products that really help, and services that help our wider audience. So that in a way, they're both challenges and opportunities. The opportunities are kind of endless. The health and care sector is vast. There's so much good work being done, and there's so much good work to be done. But equally, at the King's Fund itself, we're a small organisation, and it's about having a sort of parameters around our vision and making that happen, and looking at what we really need in terms of digital capability to, realise those dreams, essentially.
And you and I have talked about skills quite a lot, and what you're doing about digital skills. Can you tell people a bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it sort of came out from your paper, your report for last year, the Charity Digital Skills Report. How there's still quite a fear around digital, and I think it's about like democratizing it, making it accessible to people. We're coming through the pandemic, and we're all working from home and hybrid working, but there's still work to be done. And it's about making it accessible for people, making digital, something that people can get on board with. It's not this scary thing that's being done to them. It's how they can help be part of the narrative of moving to a more digitally enabled culture and not feel fearful about it and be on board, because the possibilities are endless. So in terms of skills, where we are now is like, do we upskill staff? Do we bring on staff who've already got a level of capability? There's an element of, if we want to be digitally enabled, do we just bring on every person that we bring on in all the various departments? They've all got a certain level, or are we going to invest and make sure that we bring everybody up to a particular level in order to, achieve our sort of strategic goals? So it's a bit of a challenge. And, I really agree with like partnership working and looking at what other organisations are doing, how have they done it well, knowledge share, and to sort of get the best of what is out there, but in a way that we can, tangibly do it at the King's Fund.
What are some of the specifics that you're finding teams within King's Fund are asking for from you as a digital expert within the organisation?
Yeah, I think there's one of the things around collaborative tools. We use quite a few collaborative tools, and it's about sort of streamlining them, knowing what are the most effective tools that work for everybody. Because in certain departments, you might have a digital team, they're using various things. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention them, but things like Trello and various sort of platforms that they use, but that's not rolled out across the whole organisation. So is that something that we want to take up so that other departments can work using those kind of tools, or is that something that is only for those teams that work in that way? I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to kind of look at in the broader sense. Go, right, what is it we're trying to do? What are these tools for? How can we use them in the most effective way without excluding teams or individuals, so that we benefit from it all? Is what I would say.
And why do you think there's that fear factor around digital skills still?
I mean, there might be stuff around, embarrassment. You might be embarrassed that you don't have a particular skill set within digital, or you might feel like you don't want to. You're quite happy doing what you want to, working in the way that you've always worked. It's never caused any trouble, and you want to continue working in that way. It's a bit of that, this is how we work and this is how we're always going to work kind of mindset. And that I find that it's about trying to bring that transformational change internally to show people what the benefits are in moving forward using digital. And that way we can really, get ahead in the field that we're in.
I think one of the sort of the biggest challenges I'm seeing, particularly with the healthcare organisation I'm working with, is still that sense, and it goes back to accountancy. The number one fear from accountants was that they would use some of these tools, if they were internal or external. So we're talking about social media or sharing something internally, that they'd say something wrong, that they'd get something wrong, that they'd say something out of turn, or they would post something that they couldn't stand behind. And now, sort of 10-15 years later, what we're seeing is still that sense, maybe not externally. I think people are getting a bit more used to how these social channels work. Still get tripped up by them quite often, if we're honest, but internally is that slight fear of putting their head above the parapet, about standing out and saying something. And sometimes it's the very reason why these tools don't get adopted in a way. So things like Yammer, things like Teams is fairly, people are adapting to it quite well, because it's a small group of people, usually around a specific subject. But then take that out onto something like Yammer, or something where they're sharing with the wider organization, and there is that fear of putting their head above the parapet.
And I think that probably, even broadening that out further, is around the culture. If there's a culture where it's maybe around perfectionism or maybe sort of high excellence, then people might feel even more fearful in terms of, putting their neck on the line and trying something new. And if you want to have like an experimental culture, you've got to have a culture that is allowed to fail, and you're allowed to make mistakes and trip up and try again. And there might be something playing into that kind of world, because I guess accountants, they're very precise. can't really mess up with the numbers, etc., etc. And I feel like that could be probably part of that wider culture. So it's almost a cultural thing in allowing people to go, look, I feel vulnerable enough to say, look, I don't know how to use this. I feel a bit embarrassed. I'm not really sure. Do I even need it? What have I got to say? And sort of educating them, but equally giving them the confidence to just give it a go, because ultimately we're all just here trying, winging it, and not necessarily knowing absolutely, you can't know everything. And I think it's encouraging teams to try things, and that will kind of help embed new practices.
And encouraging leaders to play in that space as well, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely, of leaders, because people are watching you, and you want to kind of set an example. Then you're modeling, aren't you? And so equally, you've got to kind of be brave yourself, but also be kind of humble enough to say, look, I might just trip up myself, but whoops, it's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to fail. I think if you give that message out, that gives a more open, experimental, creative environment for teams to give things a try.
Where do you think organisations should be setting the bar at the moment? I mean, obviously it's going to be different because everyone's at different stages of digital maturity, but do you think we should be aiming higher with this stuff now?
I think high, it depends what high looks like. Aiming high is great, but if you're already nervous about, putting a post out on social media, then maybe that's just too much. I think it's like almost baby steps, but equally saying, we need to move at pace as well. Otherwise we're going to be left behind, and you won't be relevant. It's finding that balance. I think that needs to be set, across the organisation. It doesn't always have to come from top. I think there's a bit of a myth about everything has to be set from up high. Actually, there's lots going on in other parts of the organisation that might be doing some really interesting things that you might not know about. It's about kind of, like I say, democratising digital, making it accessible, and collectively thinking, well, where do we need to get to, and how do we get there?
And really owning that as an organisation.
Absolutely, and being accountable. I think sometimes it's easy to kind of blame or sort of point fingers. I think actually just sort of owning it is the best way of describing that, and just trying, like literally just try,
and not being afraid to do that either. To echo the theme that we were talking about earlier. Sorry, go on.
No, absolutely. Yeah, just like literally just step out, a millimetre out of your comfort zone, and then go a bit further again, and go a bit further again, and that is sort of building that momentum of just giving it a go, and have a look outside. Look out, look up. What are other people doing? Where are they doing it well? And just sort of have conversations. I don't think there's a kind of textbook answer, and this is the way. Chapter 1, paragraph 2. That's how you're going to get there. I think sort of feel your way and sort of be iterative about it.
I love that, feeling your way with it. There's an element of intuition, isn't there, as much as the measuring and the planning.
Absolutely.
And tracking.
Yeah, get out of your head, a bit more into your heart, I guess. Just try it. Especially as I work at a think tank, we think a lot. It's like try to sort of translate that into more doing and tangible outputs.
Yeah, it's making that transition from that cerebral side, I suppose, of what you do, which is obviously one of the King's Fund strengths, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's an amazing minds there, and that's not to be kind of dismissed in any way. It's just sort of harnessing that thinking into reaching even wider audiences. That's the key.
So speaking of progress, we've talked a few times earlier, you and I, about inclusion, and as women of colour, how we want to see that change across the sector. What's your take on where the sector's at?
I think the sector still has a way to go, like a lot of sectors, to be absolutely honest. And I think that's one of the kind of positions of privilege that I have, in that I can sort of show young women of colour, or people of colour, that you can go up the ranks a bit. It doesn't have to be, it's not impossible. It's not easy, but it's not impossible either. And I think with the charity sector, there is still work to be done. I've worked in organisations where I'm one of the few faces of colour, and it's just, you just think, wow, how can we serve our audiences if we're so mono? I just can't see how it's possible. if everybody's come from a particular background or they're a particular type, whatever that type is, by the way, it could just be, it could be women, how can we genuinely say we are reaching all these different people impactfully if you don't have that diversity in your own workforce? And I feel really strongly about that. And I think, you have to look at what are the barriers, where do they begin, and to be really honest and open about that in your organisation. Again, is showing that vulnerability to sort of unpick what is actually happening and try to find a way forward and to, employ more diverse people. And what does that even look like in reality?
Got enough momentum around this issue
as a sector? I think it's definitely building. Definitely, I think you have to keep going. It's never over. There's never like an end point. You have to keep chipping away at it. And I think at the moment, I think there is quite a lot of momentum. Actually, I'd be honest to say there was, but it's easy to let it slide and just to kind of like, oh yeah, that was that thing. We're moving on. But I feel like now is a really great opportunity to like harness that energy that is there and to sort of amplify it so that, you do get different faces in all of these spaces, basically.
It's so essential, isn't it? Especially for all these massive challenges that we're all facing at the moment.
Absolutely. And, from big organisations to small organisations, we can all do our part. I don't think there's any excuses to not have that as like one of your key priorities in your strategic, whatever your strategy looks like, that should be definitely in there, because how else can we actually reach the type of person you're reaching if you're kind of if you're excluding, essentially.
I was going to say it's exactly that, isn't it? That you have to look at the audience you're trying to reach and then reflect that within the organisation.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
definitely. And to make it easy for organisations to, make it easy for people to join your organisation. Like some of the, you come across some really challenging like recruitment platforms where you think, well, you're not going to get a diverse workforce if you have got a really hard platform to navigate, loads of forms to fill in, or you have to write a set thing. That's just going to turn off people who are neurodiverse, people who English might be their second language. There's so many entry points, and I think it just starts even at that level when you put out a job that you want people to apply for, and they're going to apply for it. If it's really hard, straight away you've just excluded a whole bunch of talent, and I think it starts even at that level.
Completely agree with that. It really starts at those very early stages, doesn't it? And then speaking of looking to the future, what's on your digital radar for 2023, Sharon?
Well, part of my role is to be sort of putting together the vision with my colleagues. So we'll, I can't go into like top detail, but I think about working in agile fashion, and which doesn't seem very kind of groundbreaking, but I think there's something in there about teams coming together, really collaborating, and putting your sort of best minds in terms of different types of people. Again, it's that diverse and inclusive kind of narrative, and getting digital products and experiences and services out to your audiences with all of those elements in mind. And I think that's a really, really key. So for King's Fund, that's really important to us. We want to reach different audiences. Health and care sector is vast. It's also very challenging at the moment for the workforce who are involved in health and care. So what can we do to support leaders and support, the workforce in terms of the things that they need? So again, it's sort of deep diving into audiences. What do they want? What do they need? And for us to kind of deliver that.
Absolutely. So bringing people back to that focus on users, isn't it?
Absolutely. I always think it's always about people. Any kind of transformation always starts with people, more so than the tech. That comes later, but it's always, you've got to get the buy-in, you've got to, really bring people on the journey, and you can't do that and you can't deliver it without staff. So you need people. It always starts there, in my mind.
That word confidence is always there, isn't it? I think it's certainly in most of the work that I do, you start with the word confidence, because you need confident leaders to show the way. You need confident staff to be able to use the tools, and then that breeds confidence in the audiences that you're trying to talk to. So yeah, that's always where we start. You're right. You know, we might call this podcast Starts at the Top, but it doesn't always start at the top. I think it starts with confidence sometimes, and that can come from anywhere.
Absolutely. And I always think, again, like ideas can come from absolutely anywhere, and they should. It shouldn't just be a particular department or team has to have the pressure of coming up with the next idea. I think it's about, ideas can come from across an organization, be harnessed. The skills that they might need to bring that idea to life might have to come from a particular team. However, the sort of initial thinking can be, from anywhere. And I think that's one thing when I worked at Radio 1 that really stuck with me is that, ideas could come from anywhere. Although you had producers and presenters, if you had a germ of an idea, every year they used to do a kind of like documentary idea. Anybody could come up with a documentary, and it didn't matter if you were a work experience person, or if you worked on the receptionist, or, you worked in HR. You could come up with that idea, and if that idea was chosen, it would be taken forward. You'd be teamed up with the producers and the presenters, and that idea would be brought to life. And I think it's about that. It's collaborative, being collaborative, being open, not saying that you are the only expert and you're the only person who can do this thing, but equally, sort of doing it for the greater good. Like, why are you doing this? It's always equally the why as well. It's crucial, as well as having the people to bring it to life.
Love that idea. I would really love to hear more charities doing that, actually.
Definitely. I mean, I want to kind of introduce that in the King's Fund, where it doesn't have to be a particular team. Yes, it's great if it comes from sort of the usual creative kind of departments, but it doesn't have to be, and I think it's about just even making that change and kind of shake things up. And bring an openness to an organisation, which makes people feel like they can, be themselves. They can, bring themselves to work because they think, well, I'm not going to be sort of shouted down because I'm in operations and I've come up with an idea that could be a campaign. Like, why should that be the case?
100% really democratises that innovation process, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. We're all responsible. We're all, we all work in our workplaces for a reason. We've all joined that organisation for a reason. So it's kind of our duty to kind of help take it forward to serve the people who need us most.
And can we finish by you telling us one thing that you wish you had learned earlier in your career?
Oh, I think it's just to give it a go. Like if I was, when you're sort of starting out, you can be a bit cautious, can't you? You just think you've got to go with a bit of a straight line. And I'm kind of glad those days are over. But I think if I had just taken a bit more leap of faith here and there, that's definitely, just give it a go. Just literally try. There's nothing wrong with failing. You learn from that, sort of fail more, I think. Just give it a try. Definitely. I'm more like that now, way more like that now. But I think when you're first starting out, you're too scared because you don't know. I think if you've got that kind of confidence, that kind of grows with, doing more jobs. But I think doing it, trying it and giving it a whirl, there's no harm in that at all.
Amazing. What a great note to end on, Sharon. Thank you. Focusing on confidence and being brave and just trying things out.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. It's been brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah, great sentiment to end on. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Sharon for her time and sharing her wonderful insights.
So this was the last episode in this current run, but we're already planning and plotting our next season. So if you have any ideas, I know we've been out on social media, and Zoe, you've already got a couple of people lined up for next season. It would be great if you could share any ideas with us about the type of people you'd like to hear from. Should we go after Gary Lineker, Zoe?
You might be quite busy at the moment, Paul. If it stayed off Match of the Day, then he'd have a bit more spare time. But no, maybe we'll have to wait for the season after the next one.
Yeah, we might have to. So in the meantime, you can find us on Twitter, where it starts at the top one, and you can also email us at startsattethetop@gmail.com.
And if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else you get your podcasts, you can rate and review. Please do. It helps more people find out about our podcast. And we'll speak to you again next season.
We'll speak to you very soon. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.